Okay. The Center for the Study of Europe is pleased to host the two extraordinary guests today, Ambassador Veronika Wand Danielsson and Professor Julie Suk. Before introducing the topic of our discussion, but I know very well that you are very much informed about it, let me take a couple of minutes to introduce our guests with us today. I'm really honored to be with Ambassador Veronika Wand Danielsson and Professor Julie Suk in this event. Ambassador Veronika Wand Danielsson has a remarkable diplomatic career, and her career is, if I may say, centered around Brussels, European and Euro-Atlantic institutions. Correct, Veronika, if I mention that Brussels is your
far too much, I would add.
Yeah, Brussels is your second home, I would say. Because
yes.
For several years, at the beginning, she was working for the European Commission in Brussels, being responsible for drugs control cooperation with the African, Caribbean, and Pacific states. And then soon after returning to the ministry, she was appointed Minister Counselor at the Permanent Representation of Sweden to the EU in Brussels, where in 2004, also she became head of the Swedish task force and chief negotiator for the financial perspectives negotiations. It is EU long-term budget. In 2007, Mrs. Wand Danielsson became Sweden ambassador to NATO, a position she kept until 2014 when she was appointed ambassador to France and Monaco. It is actually where we met and cooperated closely, Veronika, when I was in NATO, and I can't but have a good memories about our cooperation. Your current position is head of the Americas Department at the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, responsible for Sweden's relations with countries in North America, Latin America, and the Caribbean. You were educated in Norway, Sweden, and Paris, complemented with PhD studies at the Department of Political Science at Stockholm University. Julie Suk, our other guest, is a leading scholar of constitutional gender equality in the US and around the world, bringing multidisciplinary expertise to the study of women, law, and society. Her recent book, We the Women, The Unstoppable Mothers of the Equal Rights Amendment, charts the legal, historical, and political significance of the Equal Rights Amendment's current resurgence, enabled by generations of women constitution makers. In addition to her appointment at the Graduate Center of the University of New York, Professor Suk teaches as a visiting professor at the law school at the Yale Law School, and has previously taught at the law schools of Cardozo, Columbia, Harvard, UCLA, and the University of Chicago Law Schools. She has lectured widely in the US and Europe as well, and has been visiting fellow at the European University Institute in Florence, Luis Guido Carli in Rome, and so on. She has a Juris Doctor title from Yale Law School and a Doctor of Philosophy in Politics from Oxford University. Before turning to you, Veronika, just let me briefly introduce the topic. There is a reason why you are here with us, because you know, being very involved in this, but also your country being a world leader in the feminist foreign policy. In October 2014, Sweden became the first country in the world to launch a feminist foreign policy. The feminist foreign policy, for those who want, but I'm sure that you will go into detail better than me, is a response to the discrimination and systematic subordination that still characterizes everyday life for countless women and girls over the world. And it can be described as a mechanism for equality, justice, solidarity, and peace. So when it comes to Sweden, Swedish Foreign Service in all its parts shall strive to strengthen all women's and girls' rights, representations, and resources based on the reality in which they live, which means that the transformative agenda aims to change structures and enhance the visibility of women and girls as actors. In the meantime, a few countries, I would say Canada, Mexico, Luxembourg, and France have joined you, but it doesn't mean that others have not this issue high on their agenda. But with further ado, I will turn to you, Veronika, because we will learn more about it from you and Julie. Please, time is yours, floor is yours, and cyberspace is yours.
Yes, and next time I hope I will be able to come to these kind of events in real life as well. Thank you, Vesko, so much for this opportunity, ladies and gentlemen. And there are so many eloquent people that will also speak. I'm just a humble Swedish civil servant and diplomat, but this is one of the topics that has been close to my heart ever since I started at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1990. Before they dislocated me, I was going to say, they seconded me to the European Commission, you know, when Sweden was part of this process of joining the EU in 95. And then, yeah, destiny had it that I have basically made my career in Brussels with a lot of interesting assignments and seeing the whole development of European regional integration. And then you have the opportunity, Brussels, a little bit like I would think New York, very international with the big agencies, with the EU, with NATO as international organizations. And that's where you meet very nice colleagues such as Vesko, who was my much appreciated. We sat in the same building, Vesko, didn't we, for a while, in the Manfred Wörner building at NATO headquarters. And a few years before I came to NATO, I was at the EU side again, much involved with the countries of the Balkans. And I think it's a little bit this way in life when you start working with an issue, or in this case, a region of countries, you follow those countries, you follow those subjects, and you carry them along all your life. So therefore, very happy to that we reconnected, and I will have the honor to be invited to speak to you today about the Swedish feminist foreign policy. But I thought it might be interesting for you, and I will try to be not too long, because what I think is fruitful is particularly when you have a wide range of participants, and to look at, discuss jointly, get questions, try to elaborate a bit more, and try to respond to the interest of the participants today. But I thought before I go into the main subject, what does it stand for? How do we work with it today? Let me give you a little bit of background, because also, as I heard, the US is considering now with the new administration, and this is what we follow. We actually, this afternoon was very good. I had the US chargé d'affaires. The ambassadors have left, as in many countries, but the US chargé d'affaires was seeing my Secretary of State to start talking already about what we have in common. And among, let's say, 7 or 8 priority issues which Sweden and the US will engage in together is, in fact, the gender issue, the feminist foreign policy aspects, which we will pursue both on a bilateral level, but also see what we can do together in a multilateral setting, be it in the EU, be it the UN or other international organizations. At NATO, we're not a member state, but we are a very active partner to NATO. So these issues will follow us, and I hope the American administration in the next 4 years, with much support, needed support, both for you nationally, but also for the role the US can play once you are committed. And of course, we took note and we're extremely appreciative to see that the US now has a Vice President, Kamala Harris, who already by that nomination indicates a strong support to strengthening women's roles in the US and around the world. So if I take a few steps back, yes, Sweden's achievements on women's rights and gender equality is not only, let's say, a political issue that was formed a few years ago, but it is I would say, the result of a long process of progressive reforms. Some of these reforms are very old and reflecting even an historically strong position of women in Sweden. I think this is good to bear that bear that in mind when we look at where we stand today. And I will not, of course, bore you with all the long historic facts, but I will take a few. I will mention a few key reforms, which shows already the orientation my country took very early on. And I will allow myself to go back even some centuries ago. Just have one figure that we often refer to. In 1250, King Birger Jarl. Sweden was, decentralized country, but already the King Birger Jarl in the 1250 introduced a law on violence against women. You would have thought this is quite a new phenomenon. We started working on it those years already, prohibiting rape and abduction, as we call it. I think there's still certain countries, Stan countries, without mentioning any, who still have abduction of women as part, let's say, of their cultural traditions. But that was then made, that was now abolished at national level. We jump forward to 1845. At that point, Sweden, and that I think is a very important milestone again, Sweden introduced an equal inheritance law for women and men. In other words, women and men, daughters and sons, had the same right to heritage. And that's already significant. That shows already in the family structures and the hierarchical family structures that girls and sons should be treated equally. And then, yes, we introduced, there we're not unique, in 1929, women were granted the right to vote and to run for elections. But I would say the major breakthrough came during the last 50 years, where Sweden adopted a number of key reforms that have strengthened the position of women in Swedish society. I would take some of the main reforms that I still think today, and that in fact have not been taken in all European countries, so it's not even a European phenomenon. In 1965, rape between spouses was prohibited. In 1972, some countries will not even have that as a law. Let me just mention that as well. 1972, the joint tax return for married couples was abolished, which created an incentive for women to start working, to making savings for their own pension rights. So you would not any longer have a family tax return, which still today in many European countries is the case. Women had to start thinking about, this was part, for us, this was a very important law because that created the conditions, or I would even say the pressure at that time, for women to enter the labor market and to start getting their economic independence by safeguarding also for their pension rights already separately from their husbands. In 1975, women had a legal right to abortion during the first 18 weeks of pregnancy. And in 1975, Sweden became the first country in the world to replace maternity leave with parental leave. Today, that has then changed progressively. At the beginning, it was the fact that, well, we would allow men and women, father and mothers, young couples to decide who would take those parental leaves. Both would have the right, thinking that that would also incite young men to stay home and take care of the children. But when we, after a number of years, saw that actually it was still mainly, to a large extent, young women that used these rights, and it's 16 months, just for the facts, it's 16 months of paid parental leave per child. Today, 10 years later, it obliged, in order to enforce and, let's say, induce rather, men's possibility or incitement to use one of those months, those 16 months. It was compulsory. In order to get the 16 months, men of the father had to take at least 1 month. So we called it we had 1 month's father's leave. It was even called the father's month. And another 10 years later, we saw, well, some men even didn't take that first month. At that point, it went up to a second month. And today it is 3 months that are compulsory in order to get the full 16 months. And it's not defined anymore as the father's month or mother's month. Now the law states, the last 3 months came only in 2016. It states that one of the parties, or the father or the mother, has to take the 3 months. So up to the couple to decide how to play it. But in order for both, and this has been a very important signal, I would also say, to employers. Because you also know one of the problems for women entering the labor market is, of course, also the fact that they, as an employer, you will know if the woman is around 30, 25, 35, she will probably have children. She might have to leave work for a period of time. And that disadvantages the recruitment of women towards the recruitment of men. By knowing that actually both can disappear, you've taken away, let's say, that potential structural discrimination that would otherwise exist. By now having a more equal approach, if a young man can equally disappear. And I would even claim today, even have a young son now who is taking he's just had his first child and is planning on having 4 months parental leave. It creates an equality among them towards their employers, and it is socially much more accepted today to stay home and take care of your children than it was only 10 years ago. If you walk the streets of Stockholm, you will have as many young men walking with their children or sitting in cafes. Well, right now nobody sits in any cafes; they sit at home because we're in quarantine, more or less. But it is actually exploited or used. Facility is used today much more frequently also by young men, we're not up to 50-50, but at least it has increased significantly when it was made compulsory that one of the parents had to use those 3 months. In 1999, following a long debate, and I followed that same debate then during my years now in France, Sweden enacted a law banning the purchase of sexual services. Prostitution was forbidden. The first law of its kind at that time, but which then has actually been followed now by other countries. Similar laws in other countries, not the least now France has done this quite recently, and they auditioned, the French Parliament, Assemblée Nationale auditioned me at several occasions. They worked closely with our lawmakers and even looking at the way we produced our law. And of course, it's been a big debate in France as well. So it's the purchase of sexual services which is prohibited, and not selling. It's a different debate, but I think it's still part of our sort of the view, the role of women, the respect for women, and it goes also through these kind of actions. So all in all, I would also say there's a broad political, in certain countries becomes a bipartisan issue. In Sweden, the defending women's rights is not anymore. It was perhaps 15 years ago, 20 years ago, seen as more the Social Democratic Party, the left, let's say center-left parties issue that they were pushing and promoting. That's not the case anymore. Today, the defending women's right is supported across the political spectrum, in parliament, in society. And I would also, how come it's been so easily accepted? It has taken time. I also think it's important to mention that we're a big country, geographically the 3rd biggest country in Europe, but we're a small population. We are only 10 million people, and actually, when the first laws came about, and let's say the issue became politicized, it was actually, of course, the rights aspect. Women and men should be equal before the law, and supporting women, defending their rights, their legal rights. But it was, I would also claim, an economic issue, getting women into the labor force, particularly when you are a big country, and our country is very strongly export-oriented. More than 50% of our GNI is based on our exports to more than 50%. So we're very strongly export-oriented. The Swedish welfare system is dependent on export. We needed to get women into the labor market. And that was already in the 60s when sort of the Swedish industry was growing. It was not enough only having men, but the economic aspect. And with that came getting women into the labor market also implied that you started developing social services. You needed kindergarten, you needed schools, you needed daycare centers. All that came to have supportive mechanisms, social service support mechanisms to allow women and men to be away from home, their children being taken care of in a responsible manner, so that they could enter the labor force and be part of the economic development that Sweden needed, and I claim still today needed. So that it's smart politics, but it's also smart economics to get women into the labor market. And if you just take most recent figures, currently 78% of women in Sweden are in the labor market, compared to 83% of men, if you take the age group 20 to 70 years old. And there's even been certain calculations that would claim, and we actually use this as an argument when we work internationally as well, when we see that there is hesitation to come with these economic figures that have been very useful, often more useful than the political figures, the sort of legal figures, the rights issues. There's even been, we have only a year ago, a study was published, was estimated that Sweden's GDP would grow with 12% if we manage to get even more the last remaining percentage of women into the labor market. So this clear link of women into the labor market is seen as a strong economic factor. But so these have been sort of some of the main, let's say, reforms undertaken during the past years. And despite these reforms, and despite the strong political consensus, it's not an election issue that's taken for granted. It's, the Swedish chief of the armed forces will talk about gender issues as easily as an armed person, as a military personnel, as you would do sort of in the civil society area. It is so much part now of our DNA. But despite these, reforms, there is still a lot of work that we have to undertake in Sweden. And I would probably say, if we look at the public sector and the private sector, we have come much further in the public sector without quotas. We might come back to that a little later during QAs. But just through positive incentives and political pressure and a way to systemize and integrate this, because it's been, as I said, broadly supported policy by all political parties. So you have had certain affirmative action, but statistical reviews, each ministry has to present to show how is the equality in your ministry, how many in management level, how many women, how many men. Or I think we are still behind is in the private sector. There, we recently, my Minister of Foreign Trade had a bilateral virtual meeting with her Canadian counterpart. Canada is, as you know, the other country, the second country after Sweden who introduced the feminist foreign policy. And I was amazed myself to see the figures looking at, for instance, women in the steering boards or women CEOs. There, Canada has gone far beyond. We are still around 32% women in steering boards, which for us is a low figure, where Canada was close to 50, I think 43, 45, and I don't have the Canadian figures, but they definitely had higher and better output than we had in the private sector. And I also saw figures, the Canadians were also more advanced in terms of startups. Women taking the risks of starting startups. There were, I suppose, a better financial support system. So Sweden has done a lot, but we still have homework to do, not the least in the private sector. As I already started touching upon, each government department has a responsibility to systematically integrate the gender perspective in all its policy areas. And this started off with he's now into his second mandate, our Prime Minister Stefan Löfven. If we now take, let's say, the more recent feminist foreign policy achievements, it was our then foreign minister. She has now left politics, but Margot Wallström had been a strong minister of social affairs in previous social democratic governments. She was then foreign minister. She had been EU commissioner for many years. She's quite a known figure. And she was the one who launched the idea of a feminist foreign policy. And the prime minister wanted her in his government, and she made it a precondition. I will only enter government if I can promote and defend feminist foreign policy. Those are the issues I'm most attached to. And if I now again come back into government and as foreign minister, I would like to push these issues also at the international level, not only see what we can do in Sweden, but also what we can do internationally. So the prime minister took her into the government, and after the government was nominated, all of a sudden he declared that he would now represent not only a Swedish feminist foreign policy, but he would represent a Swedish government who was a feminist government. And this was in 2014. He had just been elected. And I would say, I think, Vesko, you asked me that question when we talked, the wording feminist was in fact questioned. That raised certain eyebrows. To talk about equal opportunity, mainstreaming of women into development or in our political spheres. But feminism, to be a feminist stood for something slightly more radical. So there was a debate around that terminology. And I can even admit, being a woman, having worked also in the military and security sector for many years, I sat in Paris as Sweden's ambassador I'm a daughter of 4 girls. I've taken these issues far too long for granted, I suppose, but therefore also I've been quite committed and engaged and love to speak about it and to try to be of support. But even I personally, in 2014, it's not that long ago, thought, and you sit in a country like France, I hope you have no French listeners, or if they are, I love France. But I had a hard ride the first months defending, talking with French parliamentarians. Oh, feminist, quand même, you know, that was pushing it a bit. It's quite right to understand that we have to improve the role and you know, equality matters. But to talk about being a feminist, that was pushing it. And it is, you can sometimes test new ideas on how you react yourself. If I jump forward in a year before I left last autumn, I attended a UNESCO conference about feminist foreign policy. That was like 5 years later, a meeting of 300 persons, a lot of brilliant American experts, researchers, civil society from the whole world, African countries. And they all used the terminology feminist foreign policies, or they were pushing for the issue or being a feminist as something you would take for granted. And I saw myself, yes, it only took a couple of years after our own foreign minister and prime minister as a man defending this policy. It was, of course, helpful that Justin Trudeau joined 2 years later, and France, who was quite skeptical in 2014. In 2018, the French Parliament adopted a resolution where they now also defend a French feminist foreign policy under a strong, how should I say, strong male foreign minister, but who understood the political interest to show that you represent a progressive country, a progressive policy, a progressive government. And it was adopted with strong support also in France in 2018. This just as an example on how quickly, even I as a woman, and coming from Sweden with certain hesitation to begin with, how quickly you now take the terminology for granted, and now that you actually see it is helpful to keep a certain pressure, to keep the issue on the agenda, and to be able to push it. So back to what is, so we have a feminist government, and then we have what was then, after further, a lot of research being put forward and pushed, the feminist foreign policy, basically a lot can be said. And actually I will even also mention there's a manual today, you can go and Google it, and you can have it even translated in Swedish today, even in English, but it centers around the 3 famous R's. And I'm happy I'm speaking English today. When I speak in other languages, you have to translate because it's not always R's in other languages. The first R is the R for rights. And that implies you go back, because when I now say this is the feminist foreign policy, we work, of course, a lot with countries further away, developing countries, where you have to start looking, you have to start, if you start focusing on these issues, the legal basis has to be in place. So you have to start looking, have the right conventions being signed, are they part of international cooperation? It's a human right. How do countries stand in terms of respecting human rights, which are also women's rights? So the country legal basis will be the first, let's say, the first point of departure when you start working in the issue. You will also start looking, are there perhaps laws in place that discriminate against young girls or women? Is there a need to start eliminating or bans on policies that discriminate against women or girls' right in order to be more progressive? So you'll make sort of this legal assessment when you start as one of the sort of the first R's. The second R is the R for representation. And that second R implies that the short version would be, this is normally what my minister used to say, Margot Wallström, no decision should be taken at any level, anywhere, from family to your social life, to university, to your, in your professional life, to the steering board, to politics, to government, to parliament, you name it. No decision that will affect a woman in one way or another should be taken without that the woman is represented at that very table, defending her rights and participating in the decision shaping process. And the decision will look different And as we know, 50% of the population are women. So women have to be part of any decision shaping process, because at some point that decision will concern her own interests, will concern her own life. And therefore she has to be part of that decision-taking process. And that goes through society, to the political system, to the private sector as well. And therefore we also need to improve having more women in the steering boards, whatever they are representing. So that was the representation bit. You have to assure that they can sit, that they're invited, that they're accepted at the table, negotiation table, basically. And that starts, Vesko, at home already. Then I would also here say, yeah, then the third R is the R for resources. In part, and there the fundamental starting point is that the need for a gender perspective becomes visible when you look at the distribution of resources. Women and men have different needs, and those needs have to try to be met. We take a lot of things for granted without knowing that perhaps, you know, the instruments will have been designed rather to meet young boys or men's needs, and rather than, you know, less women's or girls' needs. You go to a sporting, let's say, sporting facility. In Sweden, one of the most popular sports have become football. You basically today, which is interesting, I had even missed out that coming back to Sweden, you basically have as many girls' football clubs and women football. Of course, the US is big in that, Sweden's been quite big. That's a phenomenon that sort of developed the past 10, 15 years only. But if you go and look at the, you know, at local level, many sport facilities didn't have a room to change. You know, you'll have, you know, basically you had young boys coming out of school. So the communes will come back and say, or the local district will say, well, we cannot offer girls the facilities. We don't have money to now build separate facilities for girls, for instance, if that was seen as essential. So in many cases, it very quickly becomes, this is just one tiny example, it becomes a budgetary issue. And therefore, you have to be able to have a budgetary possibility to support extra and new efforts. And yes, resources become therefore an essential part of sort of promoting equal opportunity, not the least promoting women's rights. I would even add a last, which is not part of the 3 R's, but which is an important, and I will start ending soon, statistics. Statistics, and I'm very happy to speak at university level with you. You will be not, I will not need to convince you, but that becomes a very important tool to ensure that resources are distributed equally across the sexes, and that you can continuously measure how are we doing with promoting equal opportunity, women's rights through different parts of systems, be it to the governments. I mean, as I said, achieving figures, statistics will be needed to be able to be more forceful when you push the issue. So you have to follow up when you start promoting these policies. You should be able to measure progress a few years down the line to see whether an improvement has happened, how it has affected, whether certain instruments have to be recalibrated to meet women's needs or young girls' needs better. And then I would say the final point, these are sort of the 3 R's, the statistical instrument, but I would also end by saying what has been, because a lot of progress, as I try to summarize, it's been a long process. We have started, certain laws are, you know, ancient at this stage, and we have worked for the past 50 years intensively, a lot in the 60s, 70s with the social rights and getting women to the labor market. But at the end of the day, it's an important, one of the most important factors is to have the support at highest level. And yes, some might laugh about the feminist foreign policy in 2014, but also the fact that you had a male prime minister who defended that he would now represent feminist government, including with a big debate that, as I said, was a debate, but that you continuously feel that women's issues are supported, defended, and promoted at highest level, makes it easier across the board. He is the prime minister. He is the face in the country, to the outside, into the partners and neighbors and internationally. And I think you will hardly see any speech that the Prime Minister would have given since he took office in 2014, be it in the UN, where these issues would not be brought forward, to show his personal commitment, to ask his ministers in government to show progress, and to continuously be the pressure behind, and never be, as I said, we still have work to do, but it's facilitated if you have that kind of support, but also interest. It's not only sort of the carrot and the stick. It's not only the stick, but it also becomes a carrot when you see that support is given and provided. So that was a short tour d'horizon, the content and the history. And thank you so much for having listened to me.
Thank you, Veronika, for a comprehensive review. I think that you will have time to go into detail, which means people will have a chance to pose questions. Just a comment before turning to Julie. You mentioned the importance, you highlighted the importance of terminology and how it sounded strange to you in 2015. Then imagine how it sounded strange to me coming from the Balkans in 2015-16 when I first learned about it, that idea. Though I had, as you know, I had spent years working in diplomacy and international relations, I was thinking, do we need something like that to be high on foreign policy agenda? But from today's perspective, what I can say that what your country did, bringing forward the issue, is the way it shaped the way how international community now understands and address the issue of implementation of human rights. It broadened this understanding because somehow gender rights were hidden in that context. Julie, time is yours, and I'm looking forward to your comments.
Thank you so much. I really, really appreciated your remarks, Ambassador Wand Danielsson. All the time when I engage the history of feminism and gender equality in Scandinavia, it's always such an eye-opener, and it gives me hope for what can be possible when your democratic institutions really commit to women's emancipation and women's empowerment as a project, not just for women, but for the government generally, and as something beneficial not only to women, but to everyone. And so I want to begin by just reminding all of us the extent to which Swedish feminism and the Swedish commitment and ideal of gender equality has shaped US gender equality law. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who passed away in September of 2020, she was an icon, Supreme Court justice when she passed away. And she was perhaps most known not only for her judicial decisions on the Supreme Court, but for the contribution she made as a lawyer and law professor, litigating for the Women's Rights Project at the ACLU, and as a law professor at Columbia, writing about gender equality. But many of her ideas about gender equality, which shaped the gender equality litigation strategy that transformed American law forever, from the 1970s, was actually shaped by her time as a visiting scholar in Sweden. And very ironically, she kind of ended up in Sweden by happenstance, having to do with sexism in the United States. Specifically, when she graduated at the top of her law school class in the 1950s, she looked for a job in law firms, and law firms would not hire her. But
I know.
The professors who recognized her brilliance invited her to co-author a book about Swedish civil procedure. And so she traveled to Sweden and had a feminist awakening that combined with her experience of sexism in the United States, which led her to Sweden in some interesting way, where she was not particularly studying gender, but it was everywhere while she was in Sweden. And so she read Eva Moberg and really got taken with this idea that gender equality was actually not only for women's liberation, but also, as Olof Palme put it, in a speech that he gave in the United States in June 1970, the emancipation of men as well. And so the idea was not only that women should be integrated into the labor market, but that men should do a greater share of family caregiving. And so gender equality law and gender equality policy had to be committed to freeing up the expected gender roles for both men and women, which is to say increasing women's participation in the public sphere and increasing men's participation in the private sphere. And that
exactly.
idea is extremely important and powerful. Olof Palme's speech was cited in a landmark legal document, the Reed versus Reed brief that Ruth Bader Ginsburg authored as a lawyer. And that led to the Supreme Court's first decision recognizing sex equality as a constitutional principle. Until 1971, the Supreme Court had never struck down any law in the United States on the grounds that it violated gender equality. But Reed versus Reed was the first time that the Supreme Court struck down sex discrimination in Idaho state law because it treated men and women differently based on stereotypes about their roles within the family. And this idea that the stereotype of women's role in the family was a real problem for gender equality law really took hold throughout the 1970s and in the entirety of Justice Ginsburg's gender equality work. And so, but one thing that I also find very interesting, in Sweden at this time, there was a constitutional transformation that took place by which the bicameral legislature in Sweden became a unicameral legislature.
Exactly.
And that was also very, at least coincided with, if not was extremely important to, the rise of very important social welfare policies that supported the transformation of gender roles in Sweden.
Exactly.
And in the United States, we brought in this idea of fighting gender stereotypes, but we did not have a parallel development of the expansion of the social welfare state. That is, we did not end up getting paid parental leave, even though we got gender neutrality on unpaid parental leave in the Family Medical Leave Act in 1993. And this introduces a very interesting dynamic, because if you have gender neutrality, meaning everyone gets equally nothing, that is to have gender disadvantaging effects on women as compared to both mothers and fathers get parental leave generously paid by the state. And so, so one question is also, as we look at the idea of a feminist foreign policy, what I find so interesting about the idea of feminist foreign policy is the link between domestic policy and the decades that Sweden spent developing, way ahead of many other countries, gender equality in domestic policy and gender roles in the labor market and within the home. Then if you confront other countries and you're doing foreign policies and you're bringing it out as a foreign policy ideal, how do you navigate the relationship between a feminist foreign policy and a feminist domestic policy? I think it's true that there's a project of persuasion by which feminism is smart economics. But I was also, one question that I wanted to engage was, well, it was really interesting how you suggested also that sometimes you go into other countries and the label feminist seems to be surprising, if not off-putting for some people. Even the concept of gender equality. There are many countries now, there's been this backlash or a panic about the concept of gender as opposed to biological sex, even as a prism by which we talk about the equality between men and women. And even when there is no resistance, particularly to feminism, one question is, if you're pursuing a feminist foreign policy and it involves promoting gender equality norms within your own political order, does it have effects? That is, if you're doing trade policy that would tend to help women's pay and participation domestically, might it have effects on women that are different in the countries with which you're trading? And to what extent does feminist foreign policy require attention to gender equality at home and gender equality abroad at the same time, and gender equality in other countries that may resist the feminist label? And, right, how do you negotiate whether it's trade agreements or other forms of international cooperation, when you're dealing with nations that might resist the idea of feminism and might have different understandings of how equality should be done on the ground there. Is it the Swedish understanding of feminism that takes hold? Or what kind of respect is there for different ideas of feminism or equality between women and men that your trading partners or interlocutors might bring to the table? And I raise this question also because I think this is a question that might come up both in terms of international disagreement as well as domestic disagreement. One thing that you mentioned was banning prostitution or banning the notion that sex can be bought and sold. And that's one issue that I know has caused some divides within feminism in the United States, whether or not we should see the possibility of buying and selling sex as something that's empowering if the market is regulated in a way to avoid the exploitation of women. Certainly there are many different understandings of whether that can even be done. But I think that is one area in which there tends to be disagreement between feminists, and sometimes it's generational, sometimes it cuts across different ethnic and class lines. But if you have disagreements like that about what it means to be feminist with regard to modification of sex, what are the implications of that for doing any kind of feminist foreign policy with other governments that may not share the idea of what feminism is supposed to be about. And then with regard to those tensions, you mentioned quotas, and I just want to talk a little bit about quotas because I think over the last 20 to 25 years, they've been such an important part of the landscape by which countries have rather quickly within a generation been able to bring up the representation of women. But at the same time, as women's representation has increased, the efforts to increase women's representation have come into conflict with a certain vision of gender equality rights, specifically all the litigation before the Court of Justice of the European Union since the mid-1990s, and also, finding a stable point, I think, in the case that was brought with regard to Sweden, the Abrahamson versus Holmquist case. There, it seems like there's this ideal of gender equality as a right that comes into tension with efforts to increase both representation and resources for the benefit of women. And so I guess one question is also how that tension gets navigated when different ideas of rights and representation and resources come into conflict. Well, I'll just end my remarks there. I look forward to further questions and discussion.
Okay, thank you.
You're excellent. You could be a Swedish. I should use you to give our speeches. You know so much about Sweden already, Sweden law, Sweden background. Thank you so much for those remarks.
I just want to take a moment to remind our attendees that they can post questions through Q&A icon on toolbar. Use this opportunity to post questions to our guests. And but before turning to you, Veronika, I want to give a chance to Daniela to to make a comment if she wants. Daniela?
Yes, sure. So thank you so much. I do have a question, and one that I care very much about. I love the emphasis on quotas and statistics and numbers. One question I have about Sweden in particular is how such numbers are collected. In other words, Ambassador, you mentioned the importance of integrating the gender perspective into every aspect of policy. But my question is, how do you integrate diversity into the gender perspective? And when it comes to collecting numbers and verifying the impact of feminist politics, is the diversity in terms of racial, ethnic, religious, social, socioeconomic taken into account? Or is the category of gender not sufficiently broken down into its multiple articulations in society?
I would claim, but that's a very good question. And to be honest, I would not be, I mentioned the statistics. I know, for instance, now Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that's my employer, that's my organization. And since I started already, when this became systemized, integrated into at least in the public sector, in ministries, in government structures, central government or even local government, there was a request for each separate entity. We are a very decentralized system. We have quite small government, and then we have agencies, which are quite important. They have resources, they have the expertise. But in each government structures, once a year, and they can develop their own information collection. Now perhaps they have it's more systemized, but this has been the case since, I would say, beginning of the 90s already. Once a year, they have to provide figures to show the number of women employed by the organization, how is their career development. They have to be transparent about the salaries. And so you basically push, we're also a country very known for our big transparency, which can shock many other countries, because you can basically request the cheap salary, and including looking at your taxes, the taxes paid. So in order to get this transparency and check how women are doing at each organizational entity, how many women have been employed, how many women are promoted, how many women do you have at management level? And those figures are, of course, quite easily put together. And they will be centralized. It was before, and that's still today, the Ministry of Social Affairs. And they're the one then presenting reporting on. It's a voluntary self-assessment, if you want to. And then you will have these discussions between, you have at government, you have the groupings of Secretary of States. They will once a year have to meet and discuss and present their figures. So it's some way peer pressure, I would say, that has been seen as the most effective way of promoting it. Yes, and some will then, of course, come up with an excuse why this year's, again, they had to promote 70% men and 30% women. But this continuous efforts, little bit the name and shame, the transparency factor, but all this around the women's issue particularly, because that's where discrimination was seen. Let's say they did not have the same facilities. We've been working a lot on the salaries, to have the salaries at the same level as the men, etc., or even helping. You'll have certain courses now to negotiate your salaries, because today you enter, even in the public sector, you have more of a joint discussion between the employer and the employers on your sort of assessments and and agreeing jointly on your salaries. But so that kind of self-assessment, statistics being provided and collected centrally for each agency and each ministry. And what was a new phenomena, and that went on for basically 25 years. But in 2017, I think it was, so it's quite a recent phenomenon, a separate agency, which is called the Agency for Equal Opportunity. YEMO, it's called. It's a woman heading it. She's Director General for this agency. They are now presenting, they're now the ones even going to Parliament, presenting the statistics, and become independent as an agency, because when it was in the Ministry of Social Affairs, a bit our decentralized system, the Ministry of Social Affairs were perhaps sometimes, if they did not see progress quickly enough, they were criticized for sometimes, not manipulating, but let's say not pushing the issue quickly, sufficiently strongly, among other priorities a Ministry of Social Affairs would have. So then women, not the least civil society and women's groups, pressed for more or less independent agency that would be given the role to do the statistical collection and refining the instruments, and even the collection of the how to collect and how to analyze the figures. And it's still early days. They have been up and running. At some point they were threatened for budgetary resources, but they have maintained their statute. But they are now the ones responsible for, let's say, the statistical assessment collection as this independent body, and that it will hopefully improve even the, let's say, the scientific work behind all this. Your question on sort of diversity, that is also very strongly pushed. but that would be through separate instruments. Our ministry, when, for instance, we take in approximately 20 young diplomats each year into our diplomatic academy, where they are trained for a year, you will have the gender. Let's say, you know, it will be 10 girls and 10 young women and 10 young men that we taken in to basically have 50-50 and thereby respecting the equality requirement. And then other, let's say, other instruments, other policies will also look at the diversity aspect and also assure that you have a strong diversity requirement and objective in your recruitment process. If I now take my own ministry. But when we go back to the feminist foreign policy, diversity will be part, let's say, of the sort of human rights aspects as well. We should not discriminate, independent, you know, not sexually and not ethnically, etc. That goes without saying. But I think it's or our instruments have not been fine-tuned sufficiently. When you now look at equal opportunity, it will not, and it's the feminist foreign policy, it will be with a starting point, particularly when we work globally in countries that are far less developed. We will work with the, let's say, the women's rights. It will start with the women's rights and assuring that they are respected and that they are promoted. Was that more or less clear? Yeah.
We have
yeah.
Yeah, we have several questions now for you, and I still have enough time. I will go question by
absolutely
a question by question. Let me begin with the first one. Ambassador Wand Danielsson, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. My question is about the fourth R, statistics, and in particular statistics in France. I studied abroad in France last year, and I learned a lot about how the French government doesn't have stats on certain inequalities because it is illegal to collect that information on people. Does the problem also exist for issues surrounding women, and how to combat this, how to resolve that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very, very good question. And that was often when I spent 6 years, my past 6 years in France, and I've spoken a lot. They have excellent, not only excellent women, even there, I must say, French women, for those now who know France well as well, they have come quite far in terms of women in the business sector, women sitting in steering boards, women in you know, coming up in companies. They are doing less well in the public sector as we do. So I mean, each country has a bit its own history. But I think absolutely the issue of transparency, which is also part, let's say, of the Swedish DNA. We are very transparent. It's part. We shouldn't have anything to hide. Sometimes we're seen as naive. And when we were pushing transparency in the EU, became EU member states, we had many Southern European countries, Vesko, that would come and be angry and say, you know, you cannot put everything kind of be public. Don't you understand? You're just creating problems. And our approach was no. The public sector is run through, you know, it's taxpayers' money, and we have to be transparent on what we do towards taxpayers, and we should avoid having all these, you know, hidden agendas. I was going to say, but hidden meetings or not being transparent and open enough how our money is spent. So it's a lot part of ours. The Swedish, particularly a country which had, as you know, also traditionally high taxes. The pressure on your taxes and how they were used has been always very strongly pursued, and therefore we were pushing this transparency issue. But if you take a country like France, who comes with a totally different culture, I think indirectly, Julie and Daniela, you also indirectly raised the cultural aspect. A collection of statistics will be different as is it Elizabeth who put the question now in the chat? That will vary from one country to the other, and certain will manipulate statistics. Yes, you know, everything will probably, you know, could happen. But if you take the 3 R's in particular, we talk about rights. We talk about international conventions. We talk about human rights. Women's rights are human rights. If you start with the basics, and the countries that want to have a conversation about these issues, they will define, they will open up their books, they will show their constitution, they will show their how the legal system is built up. And that would be it will be on the basis of the rights that they, that our conventions, our human rights conventions are universal. That would be a starting point. But then in each country, you work with the instruments that country has made available. If you then take the representation, well, or you accept that we are equal, and then women should have equal access to the decision-making processes. If that is not understood, then of course at some point you are discriminating, and then you go back to the rights issues. If you take the resources, of course, then they will say, well, we have so many priorities, we cannot prioritize women's or girls' needs right now. But then you can immediately take this back to the other two R's. When we work with feminist foreign policies in countries, we've worked a lot in Latin America or in Africa, a starting point, and some others might have that question, I normally get this question quite often, we will not come with the Swedish model and say, here we are a country up in the north, this is, we are so good, and this is what we have achieved. Each country is unique. Each country has a unique culture. We will primarily work first and foremost with women organizations in the countries. They know their countries, they know the country's strengths and weaknesses. I've worked a lot with French, back to France, since that was the example, with French non-governmental organizations and NGOs and think tanks and women in universities and women politicians. You have excellent women. They had a women's group in their social affairs committee as well, who were pushing, in fact, the feminist foreign policy also then for their foreign policy. And many of them will complain and say, France is still a very traditional country, very conservative country. This is part of our history. You already see when we try to do any kind of reform, people take to the streets, people will protest. It is very difficult to reform France for many reasons. Now they have a young progressive president who actually wants to push France in a more progressive and modern direction, who's the person at highest level who's also pushing these issues. So that will also facilitate things. But each country will be unique. For certain countries, it will take much longer. For others, it will go quicker. The main recommendation we always will do is to say, when we come to meetings, we will require to have women at that meeting. If the government doesn't provide it, then we will organize through our embassies meetings separately with women organizations to get their story, and then try to empower those organizations to work with the issues. And if there are clear cases of abuse, that's not often the case, but of course in certain more difficult countries that can also happen, then you'll try to have a dialogue on those abuses and see, is it because the legal basis doesn't exist? If you come to a country like Saudi Arabia, well, everything is different, but you can already today have a discussion on women's rights, including the right to drive their cars, even in a country as Saudi Arabia. And that's what you should know, all Swedish ambassadors throughout the world have this as one of their, I would say, top 5 priorities. Yes, we can talk security, we will talk cyber, we will talk democratic developments, social and economic development. But the gender issue, women's rights will be part, let's say, of those fundamental rights that we have to push as ambassadors and civil servants for our country. And as you were saying, Vesko, I think we have become known as sometimes the bad conscience, the country you don't want to invite because they will go on about these women's issues again and we cannot hear it anymore. But at some point, you also start seeing the benefit. And I would just, as a last comment, say, what is helpful, including in a country like France, where many women are also there in the labor market, but not at the same level as as in our country. The economic argument has often been the easiest way to make the case. If you only talk about, well, women have the same rights, the man will think about his wife at home, he's already upset with her, and then there are always at some point personal issues why I find these topics more difficult or less difficult. But the policymakers at high political level, it has, when you've used and said this is smart economics, and you go to developing countries, you go to Africa, at that point, they will understand it and they will take it in and be more ready to work on it, because all of a sudden they see if you can make that link quite clearly, Daniela, then that's a way we have found to convince rather than sort of this righteousness approach, that it's a value and we have the same value. That will sometimes be more difficult. Then they'll come up with religious issues and what, social or religious or cultural issues. But the economic factor is cross-cutting, and as I said, a good advice for when you start working at it now in your own administration.
Thank you, Veronika. You covered the question that I wanted to answer, to pose, and also one of our students already or attendee pointed the similar issue, that posing the same question, and I think that you have covered the question: how can feminist policy promoted in countries where the stereotypical role of women is still prominent? And also it touches the next question, and I would like to ask both of you to answer, to give your opinion about this. It is the similar, a slightly different angle, but about the similar issue, sensitivity of cultures. Thank you for speaking to us today, Ambassador. Many European right-wing political actors argue, often in bad faith, that the influx of Muslim refugees and immigrants into Europe threatens the region's gender equality ideals. How would you respond to such arguments? And what larger lessons can we learn about the intersection of right-wing populism, migration, and gender roles? I would expand to both of you. I would like also to hear Julie's answer to this, but Veronika, be first.
Very quickly, yes, Sweden in 2015 took the highest portions of refugees after, from the Syrian crisis and a still ongoing conflict, terribly enough, per capita in Europe. And it cost at that point the then Prime Minister his position, because he was seen as far too generous, but it was a war. And for us, it is taken for granted. If there's a war, we have to be generous. We have to open our borders and help those people. Since then, our refugee and migration policy, that's another debate I know, has become much stricter, also at European level. But yes, we've had a high influx of Muslims from Muslim countries. And yes, there has been an increase of even difficulties, of course, for young Muslim. I would also say it's mostly the highest proportion has been men coming in. But of course, that will also lead to a certain problem until they understand our Swedish values, our Swedish way of life. That has taken time. That takes time. But there have been abuses. There have been rejection of these policies. But at the end of the day, it has not changed in any way. I would even say on the contrary, we have to work more. We have to do more to explain and basically to request and say, if you want to stay here, if you want to become a Swedish citizen, once you leave the refugee status, some of them are still living in hopes and waiting for their cases to be decided upon. But if you stay in Sweden, if you want to work in Sweden, if you have a work permit or a residence permit, then these issues, these fundamental values, the role of women, the respect for women, the independence and the equal treatment of women, is one of the key criteria that they will have to learn and respect. And it will otherwise be difficult for them to stay in our society. So a lot of effort is used when we once they start learning Swedish, to explain these policies and to require that they respect them also within their own family structures. Because some, of course, have come back and said, well, we have other traditions, and the father wants to force a 16-year-old daughter to marry one, and then with somebody from another Muslim family. That's not accepted. That is not accepted. They will be pursued exactly as Swedes will be in front of our civil law, and the same demands will be put on them and the same requests as we put on Swedish citizens, men and women. No difference. But yes, of course, the abuses take place, but there's no understanding, and it will not change or affect our laws.
Thank you, Veronika. Julie, can you comment on it?
Yeah, and this is in partial response to the last question and Daniela's question about diversity as well. So I think one of the greatest challenges for feminist policy, both domestically and foreign policy, is how to do feminism in the context of pluralism and diversity, not only with regard to religion and ethnicity and race, but also with regard to class. And I would say that that
Yeah.
is one of the most fundamental conflicts in the United States, that originally, when an equal rights amendment to the US Constitution was proposed in the 1920s, people were concerned that it would end up actually hurting working class women who relied on special laws that protected women because they were mothers. In order to, they had special labor protections, and there was a real tension there. And just speaking to that, I think the last question was also about, I mean, as I understand it, in France, there's a real problem with collecting racial statistics. And for the most part, there has been no barrier to collecting statistics about women in the labor force. It's really a question, and it's not just a question in France. I think throughout Europe, there's a certain kind of unease about using the word race as a category to collect data, in part because of the memory of the Holocaust, and because race is fundamentally understood to be a different kind of social category for data and other purposes than gender or sex. But at the same time, I think that the notion that race and gender are more alike is coming into the fore also because with regard to gender, there's an increased understanding that it's not just men and women. There are actually gender non-conforming people, there are trans people, and that's also disrupting how we should think about what it means to do gender policy, or what it means to even think about gender equality beyond the rights of women and men. So I think, and so with regard to, I mean, I think one of the problems now, and I think this is also a problem that I think has crystallized in France, but certainly there have been European Court of Justice cases about this. So if you think about integrating women into the labor market, one of the questions that have come up is banning the Muslim headscarf in the workplace. And often the justification that is given is that in a public space, we believe in gender equality, and gender equality means getting rid of religious symbols that might denote gender roles that are different and subordinate for women. And that is, I think that's what I take the questioner to be referring to, that sometimes, whether it's in good faith or not, the public justification given for banning the headscarf in public is some commitment to a public signaling of gender equality. And so I think these are real problems. I do think, though, that one area in which you could probably find broad coalition on a definition of feminism or gender policy without necessarily marginalizing religious minorities or gender non-conforming people is by focusing on the original issues that gave rise to the major changes beginning with the 60s and 70s around issues of care. Because the idea was that women were not in the public sphere until you had a pretty substantial cultural and social revolution around gender roles within the family. And I think the idea that whether women want to be in the workplace or whether they want to stay home, in many advanced democracies, the state doesn't do enough to support their choices, whether it's to work home, without it being an economic disaster for them. And I think that's something where, despite the pluralism, there could be a widespread agreement across different political orders and within a political order around what feminism should focus on. Unfortunately, though, I think that in the culture wars that you see both in Europe and the United States, there's a tendency to pick an issue, whether it's the headscarf or fear of trans people in, say, women's sports. I think they sort of focus on those issues as if they're the core of what gender equality is. And I think that the focus really has to be on issues of care, which affect most of the people involved.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point.
Thank you, Julie. I have several more questions, and let's continue with this one, which is I would say Swedish centric, because its question is the following: in Sweden, there is a concept that in Sweden, is there a concept that a certain percentage of government spending be spent on the care economy with women as the center? Are there statistics to look at?
To focus on what? Sorry?
Is there, a concept that a certain percentage of government spending be spent on the care economy with women as the center?
On the care economy?
Yeah, the care economy with women as the center, which means the care economy that centers on women. Which means the providing care to something that will be, government spending, which will be earmarked on, in my view, on support to women, care for women.
Okay. So caring for women and also it's a budget issue somewhere. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Is it providing separate resources for?
Yes, that's true.
Yes, I mean there are a vast number of different instruments. I mean we have, as I was saying, since the resources have proven that women's needs, girls' needs will be different at different levels of society or the private or public sector, and in certain areas that's been one has been trying to push to have separate instruments. In the ministry, we will have a separate instruments, for instance, just as an example, because it exists at so many levels to facilitate, for instance, now since I know the foreign policy best and rather international policies and all the domestic policies, and there are numerous instruments for the at the domestic level as well, to assist certain women's group, women organizations, and there are many in Sweden, as you could imagine. They, of course, will have separate instruments that will support them also when they get public funding, all this to promote their strength and being part of the voice, the sort of the peer pressure in society. If I take at international level, now a few years ago, we created a separate budget instruments that's part of, let's say, the foreign ministry's budget to promote women mediators, because we realized that in many conflict resolution, in conflict resolution around the world, when we look at the UN, we're a very strong United Nations member, as you know, and we devote 1% of our GDP to development cooperation and ODA. But when you look at the statistics in the UN, if you look at how many mediators does the UN have to go to Colombia or to go to the Middle East or to go to Syria, we were given the figure of only 7% of the mediators that the UN uses are women. And there again, you go back to a very strong conviction that, and we have supported the Colombia peace process with the FARC for many years, with providing them with separate women negotiators, mediators, which actually has proven also in the conflict resolution process, they have been more successful because they've had different approaches to how to mediate. And so now we have a pool of 10 women that are standby. They are Swedish diplomats. So they will have a regional expertise. Some will have an Asian expertise. Some will have an expertise from the Middle East or from Africa. And they run other business, of course, they have other responsibilities. But when there is let's say, a conflict, or not the least now in our eastern neighborhood, if you take the Caucasus, there are many separate causes from Georgia, Moldavia, right now Azerbaijan to Ukraine, ongoing blockages and political crisis. Then the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs can second a UN-run or an OSCE-run team and say, we will provide you with two, 3 women experts that have developed this expertise, because we consider that you cannot only sit with 3 men or 5 or 10 men around the table and negotiate with the local counterparts. You have to include women in this negotiation to fully understand all the aspects of the conflict. It's not only high politics, and even high politics will have a different approach and a different resolve and different solutions, because we are different. We come from different backgrounds. We will take different aspects into account. This goes back actually to certain UN resolutions, 1325, one resolution, which was going to celebrate its 20 years anniversary last year, when we thought we would have all these big UN meetings, but then COVID struck us, and we will have to wait with those celebrations. But is this the same kind of thinking in peace and security field? Women have to be involved, because women will find different kind of problem solvings and solutions if they're part of that process. And it's again, this representation are, you sit at the table, you can contribute, you can listen into differently, you'll get other kind of information, and that will hopefully lead to more peaceful, long-lasting solutions in the longer run. So that's just one example that we talk a lot about the ministry, that is much appreciated, that can be used globally, and that at the end of the day required a separate budget line for that particular sort of service, if you want to.
Thank you, Veronika. I have a question for both of you that is a nice fit to what you just said. A question of one of our attendees. How would you describe the global perception of the Scandinavian feminist agenda? How do you think we can hope to promote more female involvement at all levels of society without attempts to empower women being perceived as a form of neocolonialism? So then how to be involved and engage and promote your culture, not being perceived as
I get, and I would love to listen to both, not the least Julia and Daniela perhaps on that as well. It's a little bit for others to judge the perception of Sweden in this field. It's more difficult, I find, for me as a Swedish ambassador representing my country to, without being or arrogant or full of myself, oh, we're this major fantastic country, globally respected. And no, I think many find us, I was half joking but half serious. I've been, after 6 years, after actually 7 years at NATO, you can imagine only being one of the few. At some point, we sat 50 ambassadors around. There's a part in NATO's work called the EAPC, Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council. It's all these countries. It's non-NATO members in Europe. It's the countries in the Caucasus. It's the countries in Central Asia, former Soviet republics that now are independent countries and part of this corporation. And you can imagine we sat 50 ambassadors around that table once a month. And at some point, I think it was me, and there was my first 2 years, it was me and one other woman, and the rest were all male ambassadors, including Vesko.
But my replacement was a woman. My replacement was a woman.
Yes, yeah, your replacement, but that took time, Vesko. But no, of course, certain atmospheres, certain organizations or certain subjects are traditionally more male-oriented, more male-dominated, and that changes. But I think the quickest answer to this, we do not want to impose neocolonialism with our perceptions and I think I've partly responded to that. It's working with the country's women, it's working with the country's politicians, with other countries' politicians. It's for them to define the policies, it's for them to approach us, and that's often what happens. Now even, Canada is a developed country. I mean, it's your closest neighbor. Canada has now approached, we have a new minister and wants to have exchange of experiences in the field of trade, for instance. How do you work? What are the effects in the trade field of a feminist foreign policy? How do you assess it? How can you define it? So I would say when we come in it's those kind of discussions we are looking for. Where we are approached, and we will come humbly. I always hope we'll be as humble as possible. Also doing exchange of experiences based on mistakes we have done, problems we have encountered. How do we try to address them? How do we try to rectify, let's say, approaches chosen that did not work, not even in Sweden. So I think as long as the starting point is you cannot tell others what to do, you can just basically show, listen, we think this has been helpful for us. We have helped our own women. It has an economic output. It shows that our societies, if you look at I'm not going to go through all these indexes at global level, but in many, Sweden has a high performance. And we are convinced it is because we managed to integrate women in our university systems, in our public sphere, in the private sectors, and thereby creating a more whole, a more hopefully satisfied societies with a better economic output in the longer run. And those can be the only sort of achievements and lessons learned you can share humbly for others to find their own solutions, basically, and notably with women organizations and women, women in their own countries.
Julie?
Well, I think it depends who you ask. I think for many who identify as feminists. Sweden is seen as a trailblazing pioneer in developing feminist policy, both at the domestic level and at the foreign policy level. At the same time, and as you mentioned, Ambassador, there are people who react to the word feminism. I mean, on the floor of the debates for the so the Equal Rights Amendment, which is a constitutional amendment that would add sex equality to the U.S. Constitution, has faced many roadblocks over 100 years. So just last week in Congress, or 2 weeks ago in Congress, in the House, there was a vote to try to remove one of the procedural barriers, a deadline on that amendment. But the opponents accused the supporters of equal rights as trying to sneak in a feminist agenda, as if that was a bad thing. And so I think there's certainly a great deal of division about the proper roles of women in society, and even amongst those who are pro-women's rights or feminists. I think there are divisions as to whether or not integrating women into the labor market or supporting their care within the home. I think there are still debates about what needs to be supported. And so I think the perceptions vary as people's understandings of not just gender equality, but the vision for gender roles in society. The other thing I will say is that I think one of the things that Sweden is known for is a pioneering approach to parental leave by offering not only parental leave, paid parental leave available to fathers, but the policy innovation by which there's an incentive so that if the parents share the leave, then there's a bonus. And so for each child, there are more months of leave available to the parents. And I think Sweden pioneered that, but then many other European countries have adopted a version of that. So one thing that I found really interesting, and I saw the reference to it in the handbook on Swedish feminist foreign policy, is the Swedish Dads Project. So it turns out that even in what many people might say, gender equal, gender paradise Sweden, even though there's paid parental leave available to dads and an incentive, there's actually a very small minority of Swedish dads who take an equal number of months to Swedish moms. They take some time, which is better than no time, of course. And in many countries, men take nothing because the law gives them nothing. But what's so interesting is that even after over a decade, almost 2 decades of this policy, it's very rare for men and women in Sweden to take the same number of months of caregiving leave for their children. And so that's a really interesting question too, as to how far the policy could go to changing cultural norms. And I think, of course, it's a necessary condition of changing those norms. But it's surprising to me that it's not come further. Profiles this very small number of men who've done an equal amount of caregiving as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I think we're around 35% now taking these 3 months, because now you lose those 3 months and you lose that income. So I think adding this 3rd month in 2016 is already changing that behavior, because now it becomes, when it was 1 month, they could say, okay, I'm not going to take that month because my employer might, look down on me and not think that I'm, an effective and serious worker. The father would say. Now, when you start losing 3 months of the 16th and you lose let's say the subsidies that you will get for staying at home, more men, and I can see it only in the foreign ministry, men will easily say, well, now I have to be home, and you will even be paid if your child is ill. You can stay home and take care of that child. That comes in addition to those 16 months, 480 days actually. And that is taken in my department by young men and young women basically equally. So I think there is slowly but surely a change of perception and acceptance. It's not, that you're seen badly, that you're not seen as being a serious worker, wherever you are, you're private or public. But it takes time. And on the word feminist, I fully understand. I mean, that's why I even acknowledged my own hesitance when my prime minister introduced this concept of Margot Wallström in 2014. But a little bit when at the end of the day, we get used to both concepts, terminology, and I think we should not be, if we meet objection now, short term, as you said, in the discussion you have internally now at political level in the United States, just the fact that this issue is taken back, redebated, other countries are following through, you read about it, you hear about it. As I said, big conferences are organized around it. Even in France, 4 years after it became sort of an official concept, they're getting used to. You take away the fear and you think that so much has not changed, and what has changed to the better. So I think we should have a bit more patience and look, and with time, I think time works for those engaged on these issues. So we have a little bit more patience, a new generation. Already the fact that you invited me to talk about this, 5 years ago, you would have found this, apart from Julie perhaps, and Daniela, you would have found this an uninteresting subject. But now Vesko organized this, and I hope, and I'm already very pleased to see that so many are listening in and are pleased to continue working and studying these subjects. That is already progress in my view. So thank you so much for having invited me.
Thank you, then, Veronika. No better concluding remarks than your words. We are now about to conclude this very interesting, thought-provoking, and for me inspirational discusussion. I will just pick on what you said at the end. Be more patient, and time works for feminist policy, feminist foreign policy. I can't agree more to your words. Hoping that time that will come will bring a change that we need, and that let's say gender equality will be evenly spread all over the world, because it is unevenly developed. Thank you to both of you. Thank you, Veronika. Thank you, Julie. Thank you to all who have been with us. Thank you, Daniela, as the director of the center, who supported the idea and made it possible. Looking forward to having you all over, but in person soon. And I wish you everything best.
Thank you so much.